Welcome to the Leading at the Next Level podcast with Dove Development Consulting, the show built to provide ongoing support for your leadership journey. Before we move into today's lesson, let's make sure we're on the same page. We've seen firsthand how much more is required to provide authentic leadership to a team that is simply managed based on the authority that comes with the title or position. What we've learned through more than 50 combined years of leadership responsibility is that taking the extra steps, serve people, and earn influence will always produce results that marching orders never will. If you'll stick with us to the end of the episode, we'll share how you can get a complimentary trial to a resource that we've built that's like nothing else you've ever seen. With that in mind, let's get to work. This episode is going to close the loop on some of those high-risk areas that are killing the profitability in so many organizations. And it's going to take a look at how you can capture quantifiable results. I'm in the middle of the sunshine daydream. With the importance that I've stressed about that realistic, clear-eyed, complete assessment of our current state, with that in your mind right now, I'll challenge you to get really honest with yourself, as I've been doing throughout this lesson. Do you have the kind of clarity for what your current costs are in areas like turnover, productivity, and downtime? And I mean the total costs involved in each, not just the simple ones that show up when you submit an expense report. Now, if you've taken those numbers even a little bit serious that I just shared from the Bureau of Labor Statistics data and Gallup, I believe it should grab everybody's attention. But I will say that I struggle, and here's why I say that was dated. I struggle now to picture really any organization that their average pay is as low as $35,000 in that was referenced in that study. And gosh, my guess is you're on board with me to do all that too, because to really see that, because we do indeed face some really significant profitability killers in our own organizations. Now, like I say earlier in the week, when we're talking about a group of executives and business owners in a specific trade that we worked with, I challenged them to think about, hey, does even your lowest paid employees average $35,000? And their answer was no. Our entry level employees are above $35,000 a year. And I would say many organizations face that. So gosh, when we do that, the hard reality is that we need to establish these baseline numbers, because that show the actual cost, like turnover and downtime and the less than optimal productivity. We need to do it, but it requires a lot of work. And once we have that data, it can be just as difficult to really understand what those root causes are. But clearly, there's a bunch of money that are being lost because, again, if 35,000 really were that low number, it's still a lot, but I think it's a lot more. Now, in recent years, in all the years, actually, that I worked in the whole behavior-based safety realm, I was nearly always part of the team in the facility I worked with that was responsible for digging in, doing the accident investigations or incident investigations following injuries or even significant damage to equipment. One of the tools that we applied almost all the time was something called the 5 Why method of problem solving. It was based on the idea that the immediate response somebody gives us for really anything isn't necessarily the real reason. In fact, I've heard that same approach applied in sales training and different stuff too. And through that incident investigation, our goal was really to dig as deep as we possibly could so we could uncover every possible issue or scenario that even slightly contributed to the incident, so we can hopefully prevent similar incidents from happening again in the future in our facility as well as other facilities across the organization, because we share that data, that information. When we did this with injuries and as well as with significant quality issues, because specifically the ones that were most visible, we did this, but I can't think of a single time where we applied the same approach to things like turnover or downtime or productivity. And gosh, it might have required more of those whys. Maybe we would have had to ask why 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 times instead of just 5. I'm convinced that we could have really identified some of the major contributing factors if we were willing to accept them as real to each of those things. Now, I can remember so many different scenarios where, let's say, just individuals missed their monthly productivity numbers, which typically led to some sort of disciplinary action. Fingers were frequently pointed at equipment or material issues, but gosh, they were rarely pointed at anything that was actually within the control of the person in question. And never mind that those same individuals were often the ones who were out of their assigned work area for 15, 20 minutes every hour. Gosh, that couldn't impact productivity, could it? The cold hard truth is that it's far more comfortable to assign blame to some object rather than accepting how our own behavior impacts results. The same idea holds true for measuring increased or even decreased performance when a physical change is made in a process or the equipment that's being used in that process. With each of the factors that are in place and then compacted by a society that seems to be increasingly focused on avoiding any responsibility whatsoever in every possible situation, I don't suppose we should be all that surprised when we hear somebody say, gosh, I don't have time for that touchy-feely stuff. It's easier to point a finger at something or something else. I think we shouldn't even be surprised when we, I'm sorry, even when we are willing to accept that responsibility and we do change our behavior, we're still going to need to sustain that change long term to get measurable results. It won't just happen overnight. And I'll challenge you to remember the idea of you might build 1,000 bridges before you're ever known as a bridge builder. It's going to take that time. And here's the thing, change of behavior isn't simple. Sustaining that behavior is a big deal. So when we're willing to dig deep enough to really uncover the behaviors that are really contributing to that lost profitability, and we're willing to accept that responsibility for making the changes, we'll be pointed right in the right direction. And that can really impact every aspect of our organization as long as we set clear expectations for measurable results when we do this. So once we've identified root causes that are really driving our profitability killers, the true profitability killers that we've got to deal with, our next step is to initiate that change. And in so many scenarios, though, those changes seem to be expected by throwing some kind of training at an issue and just hoping that everything magically changes. Now, if it were some sort of new tool that we purchased and we trained our team member on, we wouldn't even consider that same approach. And any training that we would provide would be very, very specific on how that tool should be used. And then we'd make sure that the tool was actually taken out of the packaging and people were executing on the behaviors that we trained them to do to achieve quantifiable results in any of the areas that are killing so much of our profit. The things that tend to really get written off as soft or intangible, we've got to maintain that same approach. We can't do it any differently. We've got to provide specific behaviors, and we've got to ensure those behaviors are sustained. Now, as Cindy and I wrap up any lesson, as you in this program, you understand where we're at with this. We always challenge the group that we're working with, and we tell them the story about the manager that I worked with that expected me to put something into action from any type of training that I attended that would have measurable impact on our overall productivity or profitability. Now, and I share with them, gosh, if I were an engineer, that would make perfect sense. We should be doing that. If I were a production supervisor, gosh, that's pretty practical too. But for somebody that was in HR or safety, that's a little bit harder. The hill was a bit steeper to climb, especially since the general focus in those roles are usually more geared towards reducing liabilities, eliminating risks, and so on and so forth. And they're more about cost avoidance than they are real productivity and profitability. And my goodness, I'm not saying it was wrong. I'm just saying it was harder. Now, through all the work that I did in that behavior-based safety role, I learned that no great idea amounted to a whole lot unless we translated it into physical action, a behavior, if you will, that somebody could see. And I was really held accountable to taking that action on whatever course, workshop, training that I attended, so it would be seen, and more importantly, it would have a positive impact. Now, I'm not going to pretend that was easy, but I am going to say that it was absolutely the right approach. Now, if we're serious about how we address the profitability killers in organizations, we need to be willing to set and maintain expectations for the leaders on our teams that are just as clear as the one that manager set for me so many years ago. Now, once we've invested the time into knowing exactly what our efforts should be focused on, and establishing solid baselines that we need to work from, identifying the necessary tools shouldn't be all that hard. And I'll stress here, being clear about the results we expect when providing those tools It's going to require intentionality, specifically in how we expect those tools to be used. But unlike getting a new saw out of the box, plugging it in, cutting boards right away, we can measure that performance right away. The type of tools that we're going to need to use to deal with some of our biggest profitability killers is going to require more support to truly sustain that ongoing application, and some different measurement instead of just parts per hour that we're doing. I often share stories from the first few years or so I was in manufacturing. I talk about how terrifying it was back then when an engineer would come out and he would kind of hover over my shoulder with a stopwatch. What I didn't understand was he was just capturing the cycle time of the machine that I was operating, not necessarily timing me. Now, I guess I was a little bit scarred because I'd been a skinny kid growing up, and I had a terrible time in a 40-yard dash. And what I'll ask you to consider right now is, do you know what a 115-pound kid that ran a 5.4 40-yard dash is good for? You know what they can play on a football team? The answer is none. They don't get to be on the football team. So I got to stand on the sideline because they didn't really cut anybody, but I didn't play. Now, that maybe scarred me a little bit. So when the engineers came out, I didn't realize that they were doing more of a machine capability study that could really provide data, reliable, say, hourly production standards, so that could be used in budgeting and some different stuff like that, and a whole host of things through the manufacturing process. The engineer, when they were doing this, they had the opportunity to see how immediate changes in performance under different working conditions showed up in those time studies. Then they took all that data and they created what they called productivity standards that provided operators like me with a clear expectation of what we needed to do on an hourly basis to achieve those results that we were expected to have. Now, having that visibility, having that clear way for measuring my progress made life pretty simple for me. I quickly learned that, gosh, all I really need to do to meet those expectations is just stay at my workstation and keep my machine running as much as I could. And if I want to be an overachiever, and I usually do, I just have to add a little bit of hustle into the mix. It wasn't that big a deal. Now, when it comes to addressing our profitability killers, that so many organizations miss entirely, changing our focus and achieving quantifiable results will still require setting those clear expectations, but the way we measure progress will be very different, especially when we're intent on showing real return on investment, real profit dollars, right? And let's be extremely honest with ourselves here. It's never an investment unless we can show a positive return and we can measure that change. Now, once we've provided our leaders, the folks on our teams, with the practical tools that they can use to address each of those profitability killers, the ones that we'll be digging through soon, one by one, individually, and really digging into those details. And we've challenged them to identify the specific behaviors that they're going to be able to apply to put those tools to use. We need to look for ways to measure the progress in sustaining those behaviors, because, gosh, changing our habits and our routines is never as simple as wishing it into being. And we'll need to determine which signs help us and them show whether or not the actions that they're taking are having the impact that they had hoped for. Even then, though, the results won't likely show up on the bottom line at the end of the first day, and maybe not the first month or even the first quarter, but the results will show up when we're taking the right action and we're tracking the impact that action has. Now, I've never been great at keeping secrets, okay? If you don't believe that, at some point in time, reach out to me or Cindy and ask for how I asked her to marry me, because that's a really good example. It's a story that when I'm excited about something, I can't keep it a secret. I want to share it. I want to make sure everybody gets to be excited about it too. With that being the case, and me being so excited to start digging into each of those specific things so we can eliminate these profitability killers that impact so many organizations, I want to let a gigantic cat out of the bag right here and now before we touch on a single issue. Leadership is the solution. If you're serious about capturing that lost profit, you cannot confuse leadership, though, with managing a process or even dictating orders with that looming threat of consequence. It's so much more than that. But as you'll see in each of the areas that we work through and the lessons that kind of build off of this one and follow, I'm going to promise you that the juice is absolutely going to be worth the squeeze, as we move forward and we make a difference. Thanks for listening to the Leading at the Next Level podcast. If you'd like to go deeper into anything that we've shared here, or you need continuing education credits for your professional credential, send us an email at admin@dove-development.net, and we'll be happy to hook you up with a 45-day all-access trial to our complete Leading at the Next Level program at no cost. The full program includes access to well over 100 hours of digital lessons, complete with slides and action-based assessments to help you capture measurable bottom line improvements in your organization, and 2 live lessons each month with Q&A so we can help you identify the specific action you want to take to lead your team more effectively.